Well, thank you, Christian, for the invitation. It was at your encouragement over a decade ago that we started to ask some of these questions. So it's a privilege to continue this important dialogue with you today and the others here. So first, who is KDI? Well, we're a nonprofit design and community development firm that works with under-resourced communities in Kenya and the US to advance equity and activate the unrealized potential in neighborhoods and cities. Roughly, we do these four things. We design and construct projects. We do longer range planning and programming. We use our work to advocate for policy change and educate on best practices. And we dig deep through rigorous academic research to understand and respond to the bigger regional issues we face. Today, I'll talk about a project on urban flooding that's rooted in research but incorporates all of our service areas. So why flooding? Well, I surely don't have to remind anyone here about the unprecedented pace of global urbanization. We all know that 1 of every 3 new urban dwellers will live in an informal settlement, and you probably also know that in sub-Saharan Africa, the pace is faster than anywhere else on the planet. Here, 3 of every 4 of these new urban dwellers will live in an informal settlement. When you pair this reality with the physical reality of where informal settlements are typically found, in riparian areas like these, the need to develop feasible flood risk reduction strategies that work is clear and urgent. Unfortunately, top-down policies designed to reduce flood risk in urban riparian zones, like the one in Kenya that proposes a blanket zone of 30 meters within which all housing and structures are deemed illegal, have created tensions with residents and proved unenforceable. So researchers and practitioners have been suggesting that a better approach is to integrate government and community initiatives to co-create interventions that can physically transform neighborhoods in a way that's context appropriate. This is an approach that we call community responsive adaptation. However, real-world examples of these community responsive initiatives are scarce, and those that do exist have not been systematically evaluated. So we're working to change that. In a multi-year, multi-component study, we hope to provide the first systematic evidence of a model of community responsive adaptation to flooding. My presentation today will outline this work to date. But first, a bit more about Kibera. Kibera is the largest informal settlement in Nairobi, and it's home to between 250 and 500,000 people. KDI first started working there in 2006. Kibera's popularity is due in part to its location in the middle of the city, close to both the CBD and the industrial area. But like most informal settlements, Kibera did not become this dense overnight. As you can see in this image from 1948, the original footprint was small and essentially surrounded by a forest. With independence, Nairobi began to grow rapidly, but without provision for social housing. So by 2015, what was previously marked forest on most maps was filled in by informal housing and migrants from all over Kenya. Today, residents face very challenging living conditions in Kibera. Access, water, sanitation, public spaces, employment, are all limited, to say the least. Land and housing is largely controlled by unregulated landlords who hold informal titles for what in reality is public land. Despite all of these challenges, Kibera residents maintain an eye toward a better future, as evidenced by the strong community networks and high levels of participation in community groups. A decade ago, we set out to listen to residents' assessments of the priority needs of the settlement and then co-design what we call productive public spaces to meet those needs. However, in the dense urban fabric of Kibera, where every square meter is built upon, the prospect of finding land to build these spaces was bleak. Rather than be deterred, we quickly saw the way to create new amenities without displacing people was to work in the margins, in these riverine waste spaces that cut through all of Kibera. Here you see the 10 sites that we've built as part of our Kibera productive public space network. But when you look at these sites as overlain with a map of the 1 and 100-year flood extents, you can see that nearly all of our sites are in high exposure areas. Our goal for the network has been to address the hyperlocal needs at the site level, while at the network level, beginning to address the settlement-wide challenges of flooding, infrastructure, poverty, pollution, and insecurity. So one project led to 2 and 2 to 3, and in each new neighborhood, we realized that the most costly, complex, and time-consuming part of each project that we built was this question of flooding and flood control. At the same time, flooding was a priority issue consistently raised by residents because it affected all aspects of their lives: physical, financial, social, and their health. So rather than just continuing to react to the physical implications of flooding by building intense gabion systems like these, we decided to take a step back and understand the issue of flooding more comprehensively. To do this, we first looked for existing data on flooding in Kibera. Realizing that there was none, we knew that the first component of our project would have to be a deep dive into data collection and mapping in Kibera. From that 2-year effort, which I'll describe in a minute, we identified 2 other critical gaps. One was a disconnect between what the city thought they knew about flooding in Kibera and the wealth of community knowledge on what was actually happening with flooding in Kibera. And the other was a lack of real-life built examples of community adaptive responses to flooding that could be evaluated and then in success adopted. So we decided to add 2 more components to our flooding work to fill those gaps. An advocacy project, which is part 2, to create tools based on local knowledge to improve both residents and government responses to flooding disasters. And then second, through a project with the Swedish Research Council, we've set out to build a community adaptive response to flooding in 3 different sites in Kibera and collect real quantifiable data on the impacts. So for the rest of the time with you, I'd like to illustrate this 3-part multi-year action research by looking at one neighborhood in Kibera called Andolo. We started the data collection and mapping of urban flooding in Andolo in 2015. And in some ways, Andolo is the last frontier of urbanization in Kibera. Looking back to 2009, there was still green space adjacent to the river. By 2015, those areas are largely filled in, with landlords taking advantage of recent arrivals and ignoring community knowledge of the risks. And when you overlay the flood extents, we can see how closely the high exposure areas map to the areas of the recent arrivals. In Andolo, our first bit of work was all about collecting data with residents. We used a number of quantitative and qualitative methods to gain a deeper understanding on community perspectives of risk. And then we did household surveys to get an in-depth understanding of the demographics and the experience of flooding. We did this before and after the long rains of 2015 in just under 1,000 households in 5 different areas across Kibera, including Andolo. And some of the data coming back shows the severity of the scale of issues that we're dealing with. You can see in these statistics here that flooding is certainly something that is present and critically impactful in the lives of the average Kibera resident. We also collected river level data and rainfall data by training residents to do the measurement. And we produced an open source hydraulic model for the whole settlement. We wanted to create this model to share it with government institutions, as well as to create map outputs that would be useful for community-level awareness and preparedness activities. The model used field data alongside remote sensing data and historical rainfall data to create flood extent maps for different rainfall scenarios, including climate change scenarios, and at various scales. Then we wanted to test and verify these models against observations in Kibera, as well as against residents' direct experience. So things got very interesting when we combined the risk info from the community level data with the flood model, including the surprising result that levels of reported flooding were almost as high in neighborhoods away from the river as those here, as those living immediately adjacent to the river. So this revealed something that the government had been missing, that poor drainage and solid waste was also one of the major driving forces of local flooding. Other results from our mapping work also show Ndolo to have the highest incidences of flooding, outbreaks of waterborne diseases at twice the national average, as well as the lowest rents in the settlement, suggesting that flood risk is known, and in Kibera, it's also been monetized. So next, we wanted to try and insert these learnings into community action and government decisions. So we ran a series of community awareness sessions in the run-up to the rainy season to share practical and cost-effective ways that residents were already improving the flood resilience of their structures. We then used data visualizations in a number of public forums and presentations to raise the profile of the issue and start conversations with residents and government partners. Overall, this data and mapping component has proven to be quite a compelling planning and advocacy tool. In fact, we used the sequence of maps and images that I've just shown just last month in Nairobi to lobby the planning department to intervene in some unchecked government-enabled development that was exacerbating the flood risk in Kibera. We're now in the process of transferring this flood model to a number of government and research partners so that they can produce their own analysis as well as extend their analysis to other areas. We've also signed an MOU to work with the County Department of Public Works on mitigating flood risk in slums in 2017 based on the outputs of this mapping that we've done. So quickly moving to parts 2 and 3 of this urban flooding work, in 2017, we decided to more formally focus on surfacing this community knowledge at multiple scales. First, by sharing stories and experiences to create a common language of around flooding. Secondly, by sharing data in real time with the settlement to inform residents of risk. And thirdly, to share data with our partners at the city-county to influence their own approach and engage them in the issues in a more on-the-ground level. So to do this, we coordinated a series of storytelling exercises and then a series of pop-up photo exhibitions and more permanent signboards featuring local residents themselves and information about flood risk. So for example, this signboard shows the dangers for young kids and others when crossing the river at this particularly precarious point. In several locations, including Ndolo, we've also been prototyping a low-tech early warning system, this flood flag, as a means of communicating flood risk to local residents as well as to neighbors and other passersby. This is a live project and part of a collaboration between IDEO.org and the Department of Public Works in Nairobi City County. So the next stage is to work more closely with government to help feed back some of this data, as well as to identify hotspots of flooding using this local knowledge that could inform this work that we'll do together with the county in 2017. And the final component of our urban flooding work, demonstrating how to use this data in the delivery of real community adaptive projects at 3 sites, including Ndolo. This component of the work has three pieces. One, at each site we'll co-design and implement a package of community-responsive adaptation measures within our productive public spaces. These will combine hard solutions like drainage formalization, rainwater harvesting, and other green infrastructure with soft interventions like committees, waste management, micro-savings, and risk awareness campaigns. Second, we'll quantify the impacts of these packages of community-responsive adaptations by carrying out 5 waves of household surveys across 1,500 households before and after 3 different rain seasons across 3 intervention sites and 3 control sites. We will evaluate the program's impact on reported flood damage, health, and other measures of welfare, as well as changes in household investment, rents, and the effects of movement of people. And then third, to evaluate the drivers for the effectiveness, or indeed the lack of effectiveness, of the different packages of intervention, we'll carry out semi-structured interviews and focus groups with residents and other stakeholders. So to wrap up, having made the site selection, we're now moving into the pre-intervention household surveys, which we've just begun, and the first stages of design. We expect to do the final round of work in late 2019. And what we expect at the end of this is that we will have the first systematic evidence on the delivery costs and impacts of a model of adaptation that integrates community and city-level climate adaptation efforts. We also expect this information to be very useful for Nairobi, but also other rapidly urbanizing cities facing this same challenge of informal housing encroaching in flood zones and a lack of implementable planning policy to address the issue. We are so convinced of the possibility of this work scaling that we've taken the first tentative steps toward creating our own alternative plan and process for the remediation of the riverine areas in Kibera and also the wider region through what we are beginning to develop through this Rivers and People plan. So with that, I hope that through this project you can see the real possibilities for a more robust and engaged approach to urban flooding in informal settlements, not only in Kibera, but in many of the other places that we've been talking about over the past day. Thank you.